As we began this rendition, the task ahead became clear. We had made a breach into British Canada, but they had many armies at large. The foundations had been laid, but we had to keep the pressure on. In Europe and North Africa, decisions had to be made. The Navy was still reeling from the aftermath of the Battle of the Corsican Straits. Eager for vengeance, a call had been dispatched for the entirety of the Mediterranean fleet to meet off of Malta for a grand engagement. All the while, the battle for the British mainland raged on. The Scots had welcomed us with open arms and were proving to be helpful allies. Contact had been made with Irish scouts who were keen for American help, especially with so many Irish expats making up our ranks. The first engagement was fought with the Central Frontier Army on the Canadian front. We sallied out of Niagara and encountered a sizable British force occupying the gap in between the Great Lakes. A pivotal battle that would leave the victor in control of one of the most important choke points on the northern front. As we deployed on the battlefield, we found ourselves somewhat stretched in terms of line infantry. The repeated engagements in and around Yankton had reduced these armies' numbers on the northern frontier. With only 3 regiments of line infantry, the Rangers and especially the Dragoons would have to step up. Our 4 regiments of Dragoons were sent towards the enemy flanks to make their march towards us slow and dangerous. This would give our puckle guns and light cannon opportunity to do some work. The Dragoons once again showed how effective they can be when given the opportunity to manoeuvre and outflank, killing almost an entire regiment of foot on one flank before the engagement had really gotten fully underway. The puckle guns, quickly becoming a standard of the United States Army, started a barrage at the beginning of the engagement and did not let up until the end. This innovative new weapon is likely not receiving the praise it deserves, as we rarely check kill counts post-battle. Each unit of puckle guns is getting in excess of 200 kills a battle, which does not seem great until you realise the morale shock effect they also possess. As the line started the dance of shot, our Dragoons sprung into action with hit and run tactics being constantly present on the flanks of the enemy lines. Our skirmish doctrine was deployed here, with our Rangers keeping up a constant source of fire and our Dragoons firing their carbines then moving in to engage in melee. This doctrine is proving to be quite successful, allowing us to face off against much larger forces and keep them at an arm's length, while we chip away at the enemy lines with musket, rifle, cannon and cavalry charge alike. I have actually struggled to find footage of our line infantry engaging in the fight here due to the sheer success of our Dragoons. I've struggled to find any moment where our Dragoons do not feature in some regard. In the aftermath of the battle, it was reported that out of our 4 regiments of Dragoons, only 3 did come out of the other side, which did seem like a fair trade for the outcome of the battle. We found ourselves in a strange stalemate in Italy as we tried to bring forces to the area to defend against the Austrians. The AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, had been brought into the fray and found themselves reinforcing before going on the offensive. Before we knew it, the garrison of London had been ordered to break the siege. They did not have a lot of supply left, and their defeat was looking certain. Our army of recruits had already defeated them once. The question was, could they do it again? Despite the fact the enemy had sallied out of the fort, it did still pose us a threat. The starfort was covered in defensive cannons that could be used should we stray too close. It was decided. We took up a defensive position just out of range, with a choke point focused in the valley in front. Our hybrid skirmish/line infantry covering the flanks and offering support from some nearby high ground. Our Gentlemen's Legions of America had placed spikes in front of our line at the entrance to the valley in a move to try to deter cavalry, and we had shrapnel ready in our cannons as well as puckle primed and readied. 2 units of our Gentlemen Brigades occupied part of the enemy army on the left flank, supported by a unit of Dragoons. We hope to replicate their success in Canada over here in the Isles. As the battle got underway and things started to heat up, the enemy quite literally marched in column into our dubbed Valley of Death. With the mortar fire hitting them on the approach, the puckles leaving them puckled, and the lines upon lines of infantry falling before they could even get a shot off, it was not long before we had victory at our fingertips. These aren't terrible. Sometimes this game, despite its age, can be kind of laggy. Also, there's the boys. It's not. Ah, that's like a militia. They're getting ready to fire and they're routing already. That's what Carcass will do, right? Despite it being the siege of the British Empire's capital, London, it was largely a lacklustre affair. Other than a slight scare to the left of our centre, we held control throughout, and exercise full control over the battlefield at all times. Moderate losses was the cost in taking London, and we ended with a decisive victory for the United States of America. However, the time to toast this victory was not upon us yet. The British forces in Canada, clearly unaware that we had just captured their capital, decided to launch a counterattack against our siege at Quebec. Our general in command took the decision to deploy ourselves in one of the outlying suburbs, using cover of buildings to our maximum advantage. We had also managed to dig some defensive emplacements, and we were confident that this would not be too much of a problem. As has become the new norm, cavalry traps were placed in the clearing in front of our infantry lines. Our rangers and skirmishers then placed behind the traps in a scattered formation, with our line infantry behind as a fallback line. It had worked before, and it would work again. To be frank, the feeble attempt from the enemy to sally out saw us not even calling upon the back line of line infantry to fire. Our skirmishers, cannons and cavalry had done all of the work. Superior artillery and range was the decisive factor this day, and another step towards dominance in Canada had been achieved. The enemy decided to approach us through the town of Naples, once again showing our enemy's reluctance to save the civilian population from the perils of war. It was decided that Slack's Rangers would be deployed within the town to disrupt the enemy formation as they approached, making use of buildings for protection. Our infantry, the elite marines, holding the line, while our puckles, mortars and cannons brought the pain. This was actually one of the largest single armies that AEF had faced. Still, morale remained as high as ever. The decision to make dragoons a mainstay in our armies continued to be put to the test, as they supported our 2 units of marines and Slack's Rangers on the right flank with hit and run tactics. On the left flank, our units went the entirety of the battle without the line being broken once, the veterancy of the marines and the accompanying cannons paying dividends. As the left flank was more or less secured, the right absorbed the brunt of the enemy's attention, and repeated attacks were repelled over and over again. Each time the 3rd and 4th Lethrington Marines regiments held the line, although their numbers were being diminished ever so slightly with each attempted charge. Luckily for them, the dragoons were constantly keeping the enemy in a state of fear and suspense by firing a full volley with their carbines, then retreating back to a safe distance to reload. All the while, Slack's Rangers fired from great range atop a slight incline. The enemy really did have no time to gather their thoughts. The Austrians, growing ever more desperate, made an attempt to charge at our centre. Unfortunately, for them, the entire approach was covered by Slack's Rangers and canister, which had been told to hold fire until point-blank range could be achieved. It was at this point the enemy chose to beat the retreat and live to fight another day. With the victory at Naples, we managed to repel the first Austrian army's attempt to break into southern Italy. However, we knew it would not be the last. The Mediterranean naval flotilla was then assembled. Every ship our navies could pull together in an attempt to thwart the British from the central Mediterranean. If we were being honest, this was not an ideal navy and was made of some scrambled together ships. From 4th rate to outdated frigates and carronades, still, the US Navy's pride was at stake here. This pride was further at stake when we realised that the USS Constitution was being brought to the battle against us after being previously captured in the Battle of the Corsican Strait. It was decided by the Admiralty that we would deploy in multiple lines in order to keep the enemy ships busy on both sides, rendering them unable to properly manoeuvre without taking fire. However, the enemy had duped us. They had sent a small force ahead, who had managed to bait us into moving towards them. Meanwhile, the enemy sat in wait behind us. The battle for the control of the Med had begun. Then the towering hulks started to appear. One heavy first rate, then another, until there was a skyline reminiscent of Boston Harbour on the horizon. It was after the battle we actually discovered that the enemy commander, on sailing the ambush fleet into the fray, dropped dead the instant he saw the size of our armada, in a massively demoralising move for the enemy. 3 of our more outdated ships were sent to intercept the enemy's false force. They managed to force them into surrendering before they could appear amongst our main forces. The enemy did seem to have a large problem with their plan, and that manifested itself in the form of them being in a complete wind dead zone, their massive ships being blown towards one another, reducing their space to manoeuvre. The USS Pegasus, a ship that was present at the Corsican Strait, decided it was going to take to the enemy formation and start disrupting. The captain, quite honestly, had gone rogue. Our new rockets, which had been so important and decisive on land, got put to the test on the sea. To mixed results, we have to say. As we witnessed the rockets attempt to scatter the enemy, our disorganised formation was trying desperately to catch up to the Pegasus, and failing miserably. The Pegasus, flying the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, fired broadside after broadside, using the wind to its favour and manoeuvring where it could generally make a nuisance of itself. Meanwhile, the main line of our frigates then arrived and took the wind advantage with them in manoeuvring convincingly to the west of the enemy's forces, trying to draw their fire and allow our heavy first rates a decent line of attack. At this point, we noticed that the enemy flagship was in fact a burning wreck, with most of our crew trying to extinguish the fire rather than continuing the fight. With the pride of the enemy fleet resembling a bonfire on the 5th of November, the enemy's will to fight also went up in flames. Some of their ships, the ones still able to take sail, started to attempt to flee in panic. At this point, our admiral decided that capturing some of the enemy's ships would be the only successful outcome, so the decision was made to switch to chain shot and demast as many of the enemy ships as possible, allowing an easier capture. Meanwhile, the rocket vessels continued their barrages with more and more success. Try and take down your sails. Switch our firing. Oh, that's lovely. Lovely. Lovely stuff. Rockets are doing the business here. Holy shit, look at that. I think we might have got some of the... Yep, 2 sails down. 1 sail down. It's fine by me. Oh my. Another sail down. Okay. Just as our rocket ships fired their final barrages, the enemy flagship found its powder stores being set ablaze and it detonated in a shockwave of wood, sail and screams. The day was ours. Pride had been restored. But at what cost? As the Mediterranean fleet returned to port for some rushed repairs, we found ourselves island hopping in the Caribbean, trying to remove the British presence from their colonies there. First was Antigua, which surrendered to us without a shot being fired, showing us British resolve must have been at an all-time low following the fall of London and Edinburgh. The British then landed a small force in Maine, their first venture onto the US mainland. I assume they thought our coast would be unguarded, but it was not. The Royal Navy may have dominance at sea, but as soon as they stepped on the mainland of the States, their lives were forfeit. In an uneventful battle, we found ourselves outflanking the enemy with cavalry, while our line infantry anchored them in place, and hammer and anvil tactics were what brought us victory. Our local hunters being deployed in the fight as forward skirmish units, showing great success once again. The first attempt at a British invasion had been knocked back convincingly. This did, however, highlight the need for us to ramp up naval production and strengthen our defensive fleets. In a once-in-a-generation defining event, Edinburgh was attacked, which we had left unguarded by American forces, leaving only a local Scottish garrison who had welcomed us in as liberators. They were attacked and sieged by a vastly numerous British force. To our glee and surprise, the Scottish garrison, despite being largely militia, held out and actually repelled the enemy attack. The garrison commander, remarking in correspondence, said, "When you hear the bagpipes on a battlefield, you know one of 2 things. Help or death is coming." At this point, our veteran American expeditionary force found themselves fighting a large Austrian army attacking us from southern Sicily, where they had disembarked. We had the opportunity to end half of the enemy's forces in the area in a rushed ambush attack. The opportunity was simply too good to pass, and our veterans found themselves fighting, as always, a more numerous foe, whilst they themselves were awaiting reinforcements and replenishment. As we approached the enemy, a large hill was spotted, and it was decided that is where we would focus our efforts. Our army started their ascent, and we quickly realised the enemy had the same battle plan as us, and a desperate melee had broken out on the summit, which would last for the duration of the battle. General Pierce Ramsay would need to muster every lesson he had learned to win this engagement. Luckily for us though, reinforcements from Naples were en route, which would prove to be pivotal in the outcome of this bloodbath. Double time was the command. Towards the engagement, seeing only smoke rolling around the hill in the distance, they had no idea what was happening and how the fight was going. As the smoke was carried by the wind, the task ahead became clear. The AEF, for once, were the ones who needed saving. The reinforcements found themselves taking position on the far side of the enemy's army, causing a large portion of the Austrian army to turn and face them, allowing some of the artillery pieces and General Ramsay himself to reposition. As the battle for the summit continued, General Ramsay took command of the reinforcements, informing them how important it was to save as many of his men as possible. The decision was made for them to fight uphill, something our country had been doing since its conception. Our puckle guns kept up a barrage of fire from atop the hill into the Austrians' rear, while our last few units of Marines held the hill. It was not looking promising, and any victory at all would be Pyrrhic at best. To their credit, none of our artillerymen had ceased fire during the engagement, bearing through heavy enemy fire and bayonet charge alike. As our reinforcements started to scale the hill, they marched through literally lines of Austrian dead, not knowing what awaited them atop the hill, until they saw our gun emplacements, still manned by our broken and battered artillerymen. As they marched past them, they realised the battle at the top had drawn to a stalemate, and the 2nd, 3rd Letherington Marines, along with the 3rd O'Bannon Marines, had fought almost to a man to hold the hill, repelling a total of 3 Austrian cavalry regiments, as well as 2 enemy grenadier regiments, cementing their position in Marine history. Always outnumbered, never outgunned, becoming an official slogan. We retreated the wounded and sick in the aftermath to a local town, and hoped the reinforcements would arrive soon. Meanwhile, the forces still able to stand and fight were asked to do so, as the 2nd Austrian Army had been dispatched from Rome. Our last engagement of the day was against a sizable British garrison in Jamaica, the largest holdout the British had in the Caribbean. Our experienced troops that had fought from Santa Fe through Mexico and across the north coast of South America found themselves hoping to extinguish the jewel in the British Caribbean crown. With the enemy force being a long-standing garrison, we did have to stay on our toes. This was not a simple scramble of locals to act as a speed bump. The battle itself would be fought in and around Kingston, once again our enemies choosing not to save the civilian population from the horrors that would follow. As we took to the town, it was decided our rangers would take to sharpshooting along the long streets while our infantry protected our flanks, cavalry in support. Our rangers were the true workhorses in this battle, fighting in the streets of the town, keeping the enemy at bay, while our infantry, largely unopposed, secured the flanks with our mobile horse artillery in tow. By the time the battle came to a head, we had quite literally encircled the enemy's remaining units. There was no escape, and the last remnants of the enemy's forces were gunned down to a man, any stragglers being dealt with by the locals who had been oppressed for many years by British colonial rule. As Stream 7 draws to a close, we find ourselves with a solid hold into Canadian land. We have the British pretty much hemmed in towards Huron territory and Rupert's Land, as well as an army now moving up towards York Factory. We have a pretty decisive hold now in the Caribbean. We hold all of the outlying islands, with the only British holdout currently being the Bahamas, which we have John Sullivan in place, along with friends, such as the Swamp Foxes, the War Dogs, and friends. As we go over to Europe, there's been quite a few events, shall we say. So we managed to sally out of Tunisia and take Algiers from the Anglaise, so we now have our army sitting there, deciding what we do next. In the Mediterranean, we obviously had some pretty big naval battles, and I would say that Corsica, Sardinia, east, we hold most of the naval dominance, with the exception maybe being up in the Adriatic. We have found ourselves back and forth with the Austrians in Naples, and overall in Italy. It's kind of a tense situation. We've fortified Athens and Morca, so we're in a better position here in terms of holding it. Then we move up here. We unfortunately lost Flanders. We didn't really leave it very well defended, and the Austrians sallied out of Paris. We do, however, though, we do hold London. We've left a small army here. We've sallied up to help out Edinburgh, and we have them on the back foot. All we need to do now is take Ireland, and the home administration of the British Empire will collapse, rendering the rest of their territory useless and free. So thank you everyone for tuning in live as always, or watching on the recap. I appreciate it, and I will catch you guys on the next one.